She had crossed 2,000 miles to marry one man. She stepped down from the stagecoach in the Colorado high country and found three of them waiting. Three men with the same dark beards, the same wide shoulders, the same whiskey amber eyes. And the youngest one was already saying low, "She won't last to January." The letter had promised a home. The letter had lied. This is the story of Charlotte Bellamy of Philadelphia and of the three Calloway brothers of Calloway Hollow in the winter of 1878, and of the secret one of them had been carrying for 4 years that would, before the next spring came, nearly cost them everything they had. The stagecoach door swung open with a dry creak, and Charlotte Bellamy stepped down into nothing. There was no husband waiting, no house in sight, no fence post, no road sign, no living thing she could name, except the wind moving through pine boughs somewhere far above her head. There was only a strip of dirt road carved into the side of a Colorado mountain, three saddled horses tied to a leaning post, and three men standing in a row beside them. Three men with beards the color of dark earth, shoulders white as cabin door frames, and the same whiskey amber eyes set deep beneath weathered hat brims. The letter had promised a home. The letter had lied. Lottie set her boot down carefully on the rocky ground, one gloved hand still gripping the carriage rail, as if she might be pulled back inside. Her crimson-red traveling dress, the last fine thing she owned in the world, was gray with dust from 3 days of mountain road. The hem had torn somewhere outside Pueblo. Her honey blonde hair had come loose from its Victorian pins, soft tendrils falling against her neck. She had not slept in a real bed since Philadelphia. Behind her, the driver tossed her single trunk down into the dirt with no ceremony at all. It landed with a dull thud, and inside it she could hear the small clink of her mother's gold cameo brooch shifting against the hard leather of the family Bible. The driver did not say goodbye. He did not tip his hat. He climbed back to his bench, snapped the reins, and turned the horses back towards Silverton without once looking at her. She watched the coach roll away down the mountain road until the sound of its wheels was lost in the great empty silence of the high country. Then she turned slowly and faced the three strangers who were now the only living souls between her and 70 miles of wilderness. For a long moment no one spoke. The mountain spoke for them. The wind moved through the pines with a long, slow breath, like an old creature turning in its sleep. A raven called somewhere on the ridge above. The sun, low and gold, threw the long shadow of a single hawk across the rocky slope. Lottie cleared her throat. Her voice, when it came, was smaller than she had wanted it to be. "Mr. Calloway." The man in the middle stepped forward and took off his wide-brimmed hat. His hair was thick and dark, sun-streaked at the temples, and a 3-day stubble caught the late light along his jaw. His eyes were the color of whiskey held up to a window, and they did not blink. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was deeper than she had imagined when she had read his letters. Quieter, too. "I'm Elijah Calloway, the one who wrote you." He nodded once, just once, toward the man on his right. "This here is my brother Silas, and the one looking at you like he ain't decided yet, that's Jeremiah, the youngest. Don't take it personal. He looks at most things that way." Silas raised one large, calloused hand in a small greeting. His eyes were the same as Elijah's, but softer somehow, the way a deep pool of water is softer than the river that fills it. He said nothing. Jeremiah, leaning against a pine 10 feet behind the others, did not raise his hand. His thumb hooked in his belt a hair's breadth from the worn handle of a Colt revolver, and he stared at her the way a man stares at weather coming in from the west. Lottie understood in that moment 3 things at once. First, that the man she had agreed to marry had 2 brothers who looked exactly like him, and she had not known. Not in any of his letters, Not once. Second, that the youngest of the three did not want her here. Third, that she was very, very far from Philadelphia. The trail's still long, ma'am, Elijah said, replacing his hat. 5 miles up through timber. The coach won't take that grade, but Silas brought a buckboard down for the trunk. You'll need to ride double behind one of us. You hungry? She was hungry. She was also terrified and exhausted and so cold that her fingers had gone stiff inside her gloves. But she straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin the way her father had taught her to do when she did not know what else to do, and said, I am perfectly well, Mr. Calloway. Thank you. A faint flicker passed across Elijah's eyes. It might have been amusement. It might have been respect. It was gone before she could be sure. Silas, he said, fetch the bear coat off your saddle for the lady. Wind picks up above the timberline. Silas was already moving. He stepped to his horse, untied a heavy coat of dark brown bear hide, and brought it to her with the same quiet care a man might use carrying a sick lamb. He held it open. After a moment of hesitation, she turned and he settled it gently around her shoulders. It smelled of wood smoke and pine and something animal and strange, something that did not belong to any world she had ever lived in. Thank you, she said softly. Silas only nodded. Jeremiah pushed off the pine. Eli, he said low, she won't last to January. We talked on this. The words struck Lottie like a slap, and she felt the heat rise into her cheeks before she could stop it. But Elijah did not even turn his head. He looked at his youngest brother the way a man looks at a fence that needs mending. She came, Jur, he said. Final word ain't yours, ain't mine neither. It's hers, and she'll have time to speak it. Then to Lottie, ma'am, up you come. Before she had quite agreed to anything, his large gloved hand was beneath her elbow, steady as a porch post, and she was being lifted into the saddle in front of him. He swung up behind her with an easy grace that surprised her in a man so big. He smelled of leather and pine pitch and cold air. His arms came around her on either side to take the reins. And for the first time in 3 years since the night her father had begun to cough blood, she was held by another human being. She did not cry. She did not let herself. But something inside her chest, a knot she had not known she was carrying, shifted half a turn loose. The 5 miles passed in silence. The trail climbed through stands of dark pine and patches of bare aspen with their last yellow leaves shivering. They crossed a creek where the water ran clear over stones the color of old bone. They passed a ridge where a herd of mule deer lifted their heads, watching, then turned and vanished into the shadows like a thought she had failed to finish. The air grew thinner. Her breath came shorter. She felt the cold work its way through the wool of the bear coat into the silk of her dress, and still the trail climbed. She did not know it then, but she would remember this ride for the rest of her life. Every detail of it. The way Elijah's beard, when the wind shifted, brushed once against the back of her ear. The way Silas rode silently up ahead, breaking trail. The way Jeremiah rode last day, scanning the ridges, never closer than 30 paces, never farther than 50. She would remember most of all the moment they came over the last rise. The sun was sitting low, a coin of dull gold on the western shoulder of the range, and the valley below opened like a held breath. A small valley hidden from the world, ringed by stone cliffs. A creek silvered through the middle of it. 5 apple trees stood bare in a row, beside a long log house with smoke rising from its chimney. A barn, a corral, a hen house, a vegetable patch covered with old straw against the coming snow. It was small, it was rough, it was real. It was the home the letter had promised. Elijah reined in at the edge of the rise and let her look. There she is, he said quietly, as if he were introducing her to a person and not a place. Callaway Hollow. Built her with my own hands, ma'am, stone by stone, log by log. 4 years gone. She found that she could not speak. You don't have to decide tonight, he said. Bed inside is yours. Door has a bolt. Tomorrow at first light, Silas can ride you back down to Silverton and put you on the eastbound coach. I'll pay your fare clean back to Philadelphia. No debt, no words said against you. Or you stay, and come spring, when the preacher rides through, I marry you like I promised in the letter. That's the offer. Your choice. Tonight or in the morning. I'll wait. She drew in a long breath of the high, cold air. She did not know yet whether she was riding into a home or a grave. But she knew this: she had nowhere else on earth to go. And the man behind her, this stranger with his quiet voice and steady hand, had not lied about the house. Maybe he had not lied about the rest either. Mr. Callaway, she said. Ma'am, take me down. He clicked his tongue and the horse stepped down into the valley. Behind her, she heard Jeremiah mutter something low to his own mount, and the sound of it was bitter as cold coffee. The cabin was warmer than she had dared hope. Silas had ridden ahead and stoked the fire. When she stepped through the doorway with the bear coat hanging heavy on her shoulders, a wave of pine smoke and bread warmth and the tang of dried herbs hit her so hard she had to put a hand against the doorframe. The room was long and low. A great stone hearth took up half one wall. A long pine table stood in the middle, scrubbed pale by years of soap and water. A black iron stove squatted in the corner. Skins lay on the plank floor. Antlers held coats and hats and one good rifle. A loft for sleeping rose at the back, and a single closed door beside it, plain and heavy with iron hinges. That door, she would learn, was hers. Elijah set her trunk inside and stepped back into the cold. Silas was already bringing in stew. Jeremiah did not come in at all. She heard his boots on the plank porch, then on the steps, then the snap of the barn latch, and that was where he went. She did not see him again that night. She ate at the long table with the two older brothers in a silence that was not unkind. Elk stew, hot and dark with cornbread, Silas had baked that very morning, and a cup of strong black coffee. She had not eaten a hot meal in 3 days. She had to keep her shoulders very still to keep from weeping into the bowl. Elijah noticed. He did not comment. He simply moved the salt across the table within her reach and said without looking up, "There's plenty more, ma'am. We don't run short here." When the meal was done, he stood. "Silas will show you your room. Bolts on the inside. There's a basin and a pitcher and water on the stove if you want it warm. I'll be in the barn. Anything you need in the night, knock on Silas's door. Sleep as long as you like in the morning. Nobody'll wake you." He paused at the door. He did not look at her. "Lock your bolt, ma'am, not because of us, because it's a habit worth keeping in this country. You hear? I hear Mr. Callaway." "Eli," he said. Then he was gone. In her room, the door closed behind her. Lottie set her single candle on the small table by the bed and stood very still looking. The room was plain and clean. A bed wide enough for two layered with a quilt of dark blue and faded red. A window with iron shutters. A washstand. A small shelf with 3 books she could just see the spines of in the candlelight. A Bible, a worn copy of Pilgrim's Progress, and a thin volume of poetry she could not yet read the title of. And then she saw it. Beside the door, set into the log wall at the height of a woman's shoulder, was a single iron hook, hand-forged, slightly bent. The wood around it had been smoothed by use, but no coat hung from it, no shawl, nothing. It was empty. It had been empty for a long time. There was already a hook on the inside of the door for a coat. This second hook was for a woman's shawl. She put her hand against it and her fingers were trembling, and she did not know why. Someone had built this room before her. Someone had hammered this hook into this wall with a woman in mind years before her name had ever been on a piece of paper. Someone had been waiting. She stood there, Olengi Tama, with her hand on the cold iron, while outside the wind began to rise against the cabin walls. Then she did something she had not planned to do. She slid the bolt. But she did not lock it. She let it rest half-drawn, neither open nor closed. She slept that night more deeply than she had slept since her father's funeral. She did not dream. She did not know that in the barn Elijah Calloway sat awake by a small lantern with his head in his hands, and that his shoulders shook once and only once before he wiped his face with the back of his wrist and went out to check the horses in the dark. To understand why a young woman of Philadelphia good breeding had stepped off a stagecoach into a Colorado mountain to marry a man she had never seen, you must first understand what was left behind. Charlotte Bellamy had not always been alone. Her father, Tobias Bellamy, had been a doctor in Philadelphia for 34 years. A man of slender build, careful hands, and a voice so gentle that women in labor sometimes wept for relief at the mere sound of him entering the room. He had taught Lottie to read at the age of 4, to play the small parlor piano at 6, to assist him with bandages and tinctures and the cleaning of small wounds at 12. He had never raised his voice to her. He had never told her she was less for being a girl. He had told her once on her 16th birthday that her mind was the finest one he had encountered in any of his patients, and that he expected great things of it. Her mother had died of a long fever when Lottie was 12. Her father had borrowed against the house to pay for the doctors who could not save her. He never spoke of the debt. He never told Lottie. He carried it the way he carried everything, in silence. Then in the last year of his life, the cough had come. It was the same cough she had heard all her life from his patients. She knew it before he did. She watched him grow thin. She watched him cough into the white handkerchief and fold the handkerchief small so she would not see the red. She watched him work right up to the last week while the neighbors crossed the street to avoid their door because the word consumption was a word that emptied houses. She buried him on a Tuesday in early September. By Thursday, the bank had taken the house. By Sunday, she had a single trunk railway ticket West bought with the last of her father's medical bags sold in trade and a folded advertisement torn from the back page of the Boston Herald. The advertisement read in small, even type, "Strong woman wanted. Mountain homestead, Colorado territory. Hard life. Fair man. Honest work. 3 brothers offer protection and home in exchange for 1 wife. Letters welcome. E. Calloway. Care of Silverton General Store, Silverton, Colorado." She had answered that night by candlelight in the boarding house room of a stranger. She had not expected him to write back. He had written back 6 days later. The handwriting was strong and plain. The grammar was simple but not unschooled. The letter said, "Miss Bellamy, your letter found me. I'll be plain. I'm 32 years old. I keep 480 acres in San Juan country. I keep 2 brothers besides me. I lost a woman I was promised to in 1864, and I have not looked at another since. I don't drink. I don't strike. I keep my word. The work is hard. The winters are harder. If you write me again, I'll write you back. E. Calloway." She had written him again. She had written him every Sunday for 6 months. He had written back every time, never long, never flowery, but never cold. He had told her about the apple trees his father had carried as saplings from Virginia and planted at the homestead the year before he died. He had told her that the spring above the cabin ran cold and clear all year and never once dried even in the summer of '76 when half the wells in the territory went dust. He had told her that the nearest neighbor, the preacher Obadiah Hendricks, was 35 miles south. He had told her his middle brother was a quiet man who read books and his youngest brother carried a temper but a true heart underneath. He had not told her his middle brother and his youngest brother looked exactly like him. He had not told her there were three of him. That had been the first lie of the letter, and as she lay in the strange bed in the strange room with the iron hook empty beside the door, she could not yet decide whether it was a lie that mattered or a lie that did not. She would learn the answer in the morning. She woke to the smell of bacon. Pale light was leaking through the iron shutters. She had no idea what time it was. She rose stiff in every joint, splashed water on her face from the basin, dressed in the only other gown she owned, a simpler dark blue wool, and pinned her hair as best she could without a proper mirror. Her crimson traveling dress hung on the inside of the door, brushed clean of its dust. She did not remember brushing it. She opened the door. Silas stood at the iron stove with his back to her, broad as a barn beam, turning bacon in a black skillet with the easy motion of a man who had been cooking for himself for years. There was coffee in a pot on the hearth. There was a plate already set for her at the long table, and beside it in a small glass canning jar, with no water in it because they had no flowers in November, was a single sprig of dark blue dried lavender. She stopped in the doorway. Silas turned, saw her, and a slow, gentle smile broke across his bearded face. He inclined his head toward the table. "Morning, ma'am." "Good morning." "Eli's gone north on the pasture, just chopping for winter. Said tell you breakfast is yours when you want it. Don't rush." She sat. She picked up the sprig of lavender. She looked at it for a long moment. "Did you put this here, Mr. Calloway?" He set the skillet down. He did not turn back to her. His large shoulders shifted under his linen shirt as he reached for a plate. "Silas," he said. "Silas. My mother kept lavender by every plate at every breakfast of my life," he said, still not turning. "Said it kept the air sweet and the day kind. Habit, ma'am, nothing more." She held the dried sprig in her hand. The cabin was warm. The bacon was hot. The coffee, when she poured it, was black and strong and real. She decided, sitting there at that long pine table with the small sprig of lavender beside her plate, that she was not going back to Philadelphia. Not down the trail with Silas that morning. Not on any coach east. Not ever. She did not say so out loud. But when an hour later Elijah came in from the north pasture with cold mud on his boots and his great hat in his hand and stood inside the door and said very quietly without quite looking at her, "Ma'am, Silas is saddling up. You changed your mind in the night. Now's the moment to say so." She set down her coffee cup and met his eyes across the room. "Mr. Calloway," she said. "Ma'am, I am staying. I would like, if you please, to discuss the terms of our arrangement properly, like sensible people, over the table." He looked at her. For the first time since she had stepped down from that stagecoach, the lines around his whiskey amber eyes softened, just at the corners, just enough that she saw them. He did not smile, but he closed the door slowly behind him and laid his hat on the peg beside it, and he said in that same quiet voice that did not push and did not pull, "Yes, ma'am, I'll fetch the brothers." He took down a folded paper from a tin on the shelf above the hearth. It had been written, she could see, days before her arrival. Maybe weeks. The ink was faded a little at the top. He had been ready. It was a contract. Silas was already drying his hands. Outside, Jeremiah's axe stopped its rhythmic ringing. A minute later, he came through the door with chips of pine still clinging to his sleeves, and the look on his face was a storm that had not yet decided whether to break or roll past. The four of them sat at the long pine table. Elijah laid the paper in the center. "Read it aloud, Eli," Silas said gently. "She has a right to hear it from your own mouth." Elijah cleared his throat. He read, "Charlotte Bellamy of Philadelphia agrees to marry Elijah Calloway of San Juan County, Colorado, when the circuit preacher next rides through the high country, no later than the first thaw of spring. In exchange, the brothers Calloway, being Elijah, Silas, and Jeremiah, jointly and severally pledge the following. 1. A roof, 4 walls, fire, and bed under their own hands. 2. 3 meals a day and plenty of meat and bread and what the garden gives. 3. The protection of 3 armed men to the last drop of their blood against any harm by beast, weather, or wicked man. 4. A bedroom for her sole use with the bolt on the inside, no claim of marital duty made upon her until such time as she herself freely and without pressure of any kind says otherwise. 5. The right, if she is not content to leave at any time within the first 12 months, with safe escort to Silverton and full passage paid back to Philadelphia, no debt asked, no words spoken against her by any Calloway ever." He folded the paper down and looked across the table at her. "5 points, ma'am. I'll add or strike whatever you wish." She had not expected that. In the parlor of any house in Philadelphia, a woman's wishes were written down by a man's hand, on a man's terms, in a man's ink. Her father had written her mother's marriage articles and read them to her after they were done. She had not been asked. "Mr. Calloway," she said carefully, "I would add 1 point. Name it. That whatever I learn of frontier work, of cooking, of garden, of whatever skill any one of you 3 possess, you will teach me when I ask, patiently, without mocking me. I am not a useless thing. I do not intend to be carried." A small pause. Then Silas very quietly said, "Yes, ma'am." And Elijah said, "Granted, with pleasure." And Jeremiah, who had not yet said a word in her presence, who had sat through breakfast in the barn and through this whole reading with his arms folded and his jaw set, finally spoke. "I'll teach you to shoot," he said. She turned her head toward him. She had not expected his voice to come out the way it did. There was no warmth in it, but there was no cruelty in it either. It was the voice of a man laying down a tool he had decided finally to share. "Thank you, Mr. Calloway." "Jer." "Thank you, Jer." He looked away first. Elijah dipped a steel pen into the small inkwell at the edge of the table and wrote her 6th point in his careful hand at the bottom of the contract. He turned the paper to her. He held out the pen. She took it. She signed her name in the long, full curl of her father's old script, Charlotte Edith Bellamy. Below her name, the 3 brothers signed in turn. Elijah first with hard, plain strokes. Silas next slightly slanted, almost like a man bowing. Jeremiah last with a fast, hard hand that almost tore the paper. Then it was done. Outside, somewhere far up the valley, a hawk cried high and lonely. Inside, the 4 of them sat for a moment around the long pine table, and the only sound was the iron stove ticking as it cooled. Lottie said, because she could think of nothing else, "Well." And Elijah, the steady one, the man who had not yet smiled, finally did. Just the corner of his mouth, just for her. "Welcome home, Miss Bellamy," he said. That night, when she went to her room and set the candle on the small table, she stood once more before the empty iron hook beside the door. She lifted the bear coat Silas had given her on the trail off her shoulders. She had folded it across the foot of the bed the night before. This time she lifted it instead and hung it on the hook. The hook held it perfectly, as though it had always been waiting for exactly that weight. She stood looking at it for a long time. Outside, the wind came down off the high peaks of the San Juans and pressed long and slow against the cabin walls. The first true snow of the year began to fall soft and certain on the bare apple trees and the still creek and the low roof of the only home she had left in the world. She did not know yet that one of the men sleeping under that same roof carried a secret 4 years old that would, before the next spring came, nearly cost them everything they had. She did not know yet that a man named Cyrus Drake, in a fine office in Denver, had already spoken her name aloud to 2 hired riders and had paid them in silver and had pointed at a map. She did not know yet that the empty iron hook beside her door had been hammered into that wall 4 years before by a man who had once loved a woman named Cordelia Whitfield and had buried her in 1864 alone in a grave in Virginia he had not stood beside since the war. She did not know any of that on this first true night in Callaway Hollow. She knew only that a sprig of dried lavender lay on her nightstand, and a bear coat hung on a hook that had waited years for it, and 3 large men were sleeping under one roof with her, and she had, for the first time since her father died, locked no door against the night. She blew out the candle. She slept, and the snow kept falling slow and steep over the high mountain valley where the rest of her life was about to begin. When Lottie woke before dawn, the iron shutters of her window were lined silver with frost, and the world outside lay buried under a clean white silence so deep it seemed to have erased the very mountains. She lay still for a long moment under the heavy quilt listening. There was no sound, no wind, no bird, only the soft tick of the iron stove cooling somewhere in the great room beyond her door, and the slow rhythm of her own breath in the cold air. Then a single sound came, the dull, steady thunk of an axe striking wood. Jeremiah was already up. She rose. She washed her face from the cold basin. She dressed in her dark blue wool, pinned her hair, and found her bear coat hanging on the iron hook beside the door exactly where she had left it the night before. She lifted it down, settled it around her shoulders, and stood looking at the empty hook for a moment longer than she meant to. Then she opened the door and stepped out into her new life. Silas was already at the stove. He had built up the fire. A pot of oats was simmering. Coffee, black and strong, was waiting on the hearth in the dented tin pot she would come in time to know better than her own hand. He turned at her step. "Morning, ma'am." "Good morning, Silas." He inclined his head toward a smaller pot beside the oats. "Cream. Eli walked the cow before light. There's molasses in the jar there if you've a sweet tooth. Eli says a body don't last on this mountain without a little sweet in the morning." She found to her own surprise that she smiled. "And what does Jeremiah say?" Silas's mouth quirked at one corner. "Jer says coffee strong enough to peel paint, and don't ask him no more questions till noon." "I see." "You'll learn his ways, ma'am. He's all weather and no warning, but there's no harm in him. None at all." She sat at the long pine table. Silas brought her oats with a careful hand, the bowl steaming. He set down the molasses jar within her reach without being asked. Then he took his own bowl to the far end of the table, sat down, and began to eat in the comfortable silence of a man who had eaten alone for a long time and did not yet know what to do with the company of a woman. She watched him a moment, the slow, careful way he turned his spoon, the faint scar at the edge of his jaw, the way his eyes, when they lifted, did not quite meet hers but did not refuse her either, the way a quiet man could fill a room without filling the air. "Silas?" "Ma'am." "Lottie, please. I cannot bear another month of ma'am." He paused. He set his spoon down. He looked at her then fully for the first time, and his whiskey amber eyes were softer in the firelight than she had seen them in any of the brothers yet. Lottie, he said. It was the first time her name had been spoken in this house. She found she had to look down at her bowl quickly because her eyes had gone wet without her permission. The first week passed in a steady rhythm of cold and labor and small kindnesses she did not yet know how to count. Elijah was up before dawn every day. He walked the north pasture in the dark with a lantern breaking ice on the water troughs with the back of an axe counting cattle by lantern light, returning at first true light with snow caked along the shoulders of his coat. He did not speak much. At breakfast, he did not need to. He came in. He hung his hat on its peg. He nodded at her once. He sat. He ate. He went out again. The whole shape of his day was a man keeping a promise to 20 head of cattle, 6 horses, 2 mules, and 30 laying hens every hour of every day in weather that did not care whether he lived or died. Silas kept the cabin and the cooking and the smaller animals. He baked bread 3 times a week in the iron stove. He patched harness in the long evenings. He read Walt Whitman aloud very softly to himself when he thought no one was listening. He showed Lottie how to bank the stove for the night, how to lift the heavy iron lid without burning her wrist, how to test the temperature of the oven by holding her bare hand inside it for a slow count of 3. He never showed her anything twice in the same way. He found a new gentle phrase for it each time until she had learned. Jeremiah split wood. He split wood from before light until full dark. With one short break for breakfast, he ate standing on the porch, and one longer break for supper at the long table in a silence that the others let him keep. He did not speak to her. He did not look at her. He moved through the cabin like a tall shadow that came in for warmth and went out again before the warmth could touch him. Lottie watched him all that first week. She did not press. She did not call him to the table when he stayed out past dark. She simply set a covered plate on the warming shelf above the stove every night, and every morning the plate was on the wash counter scraped clean. He was eating it. He was just not eating it with her. That was a beginning, she thought. A man who would not look at her, but who would eat her food. A door that was closed but not yet locked. She could work with that. On the 8th morning, Silas began the lessons. He took her into the cabin pantry, a small room off the kitchen lined with shelves and barrels and dark glass jars, and he showed her slowly and patiently the whole shape of how 3 men had been keeping themselves alive on this mountain for 4 years. Salted pork in one barrel, smoked elk in another, dried apples in muslin sacks from the trees outside, cornmeal, white flour kept in a tin to keep the mice out, a whole shelf of canned tomatoes from a summer garden she had not yet seen but would come to know, lard, honey from a wild hive Jeremiah had robbed in August, coffee beans in a sealed crock, tea in a small green tin, finer than she had expected to find on a mountain. Eli rode 150 miles for that tea, ma'am. Lottie, beg pardon. He read in your second letter that you'd been raised on it. She stopped. She turned slowly to face him. He rode 150 miles. To Pueblo. There's a merchant there carries the proper kind. He went in October. Said if you came, you'd want it. Said if you didn't come, he'd still drink it himself till it ran out and think on what might have been. She did not trust herself to speak. Silas set the small green tin gently into her hands. He didn't tell me to tell you that, Lottie. I'm telling you because I think you ought to know. My brother does not say the soft things. He never has. But the soft things with Eli are always there. You just have to know where to look. She held the small green tin against her ribs all the way back into the kitchen. That night she made tea. She made it the way her father had taught her, the proper way, with the water just under the boil. The leaves measured to the spoon, the pot warmed first with a splash of hot water poured out. She set 3 cups on the table, then after a moment a fourth, and she carried the fourth herself out to the porch where Jeremiah was sharpening an axe by lantern light in the cold. She set the cup down on the porch rail beside him. "It is too cold for whiskey, Mr. Calloway. I have brought you tea instead." He did not look up from the whetstone. "I don't drink tea." "You will drink this one." He looked up. For a long moment he looked at her, and she could see in his eyes the same storm she had seen on the trail, but it was a smaller storm now. It was a storm that had begun to remember it was tired. He set the axe down. He picked up the cup. He drank in one long swallow like a man taking medicine. Then he set the cup back on the rail, picked up the axe, and went back to his whetstone. But he did not tell her to go away. She stood on the porch with him for a quarter of an hour in the cold, neither of them speaking, the lantern between them, turning his breath and her breath into one slow shared cloud, and then she went inside and closed the door softly behind her. The cup was empty. In the morning the cup was washed and dried and back in its place on the shelf. She had not put it there. The shooting lesson came on the 10th day. Snow had stopped falling. The sky was a hard, glassy blue. Jeremiah came in at mid-morning, damp snow from his boots at the door, and said without looking at her, "Coat up, bring the bear hide. We're going out." She did not ask where. She put on her coat. She wrapped a wool scarf Silas had set aside for her around her throat. She followed him. He led her down past the apple trees across the frozen creek where the ice rang under their boots and up a small bare slope to a clearing where someone long ago had stood 3 pine rounds on end as targets. The wood was scarred white with old bullet pocks. He carried 2 rifles. He carried a smaller pistol in his belt. He set the rifles down on a folded blanket on a flat rock and took out the pistol first. He held it on his open palm. "This is a Colt. 5 shots, single action, means you cock the hammer every time. You squeeze, you don't pull. You squeeze like you're holding a baby bird. Too tight, you crush it. Too soft, it flies. You understand the words. I understand the words. Show me your hands." She held out her hands. He took her right hand in his. His own hand was nearly twice the size of hers, scarred along the knuckles, calloused at the base of every finger, the nails clean but cut down to the quick from work. He turned her palm up. He laid the cold weight of the pistol across it. She had never held a gun in her life. "Heavier than it looks," she said. "They always are." He stepped behind her then. He did not touch her. He stood half a step back and he spoke over her shoulder, his voice gone low and even, the voice of a man teaching the only thing he believed he had to give. "Feet apart, square to the target. Not turned sideways, that's for fancy gentlemen in pictures. You're going to get shot at sideways. You want to be square. Makes you smaller. Lift the gun, both hands. Yes. Now thumb the hammer all the way back. You hear that click? That's the only friend you got. You hear that click. You got one breath to make peace with the world before you squeeze. You don't squeeze on a held breath neither. You let half of it out. You squeeze on the half-out breath." She did exactly as he said. The Colt jumped in her hand. The sound of it slammed against the cliffs and came back twice. The pine round at 30 paces sat untouched. "Missed. You missed by a hand," he said. "Best shot of your life. That's not missing. That's good shooting that didn't hit. Cock again." She cocked. Squeeze. Squeeze. She squeezed. The pine round split a chunk off his left shoulder. She lowered the gun. She turned her face toward him. He was standing very still, half a step behind, and his whiskey amber eyes were not on the target. They were on her, and there was something in them she had not seen before in any of the three brothers. Not on the trail, not at the contract table, not in the cabin. It was the look of a man who had just remembered against his will that the world contained things worth protecting. He looked away first. He cleared his throat. 3 more rounds, then we'll try the rifle. You got a good eye, Miss Bellamy. Steadier than I expected. Lottie? A long pause. Lottie. 3 weeks in Elijah began to come in for tea. He did not announce it. He did not ask. He simply began around 4 in the afternoon to find some small reason to step into the cabin from whatever he had been doing in the cold, to check a strap, to fetch a length of rope, to warm his hands a moment by the stove. And somehow every time there would be a cup of tea waiting on the corner of the table, and he would lift it without comment and drink it standing and set it down again and go back out. She never saw him sit for it. But she came to count those small unspoken arrivals as the rhythm by which she now told her own afternoon. 3 o'clock the kettle went on. 3:30 the leaves went in. 4 the cup was on the table. 4:10 he was at the door. On the 23rd day of her life in Callaway Hollow, he did sit. He came in cold. There was new ice in his beard. He hung his hat. He lifted the cup. And then instead of drinking, standing, he pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat down with the cup in both hands, and he said very quietly, without looking at her, "Miss Bellamy." "Lottie, please." "Lottie." He paused. He turned the cup half a turn between his palms. "I owe you a thing. I should have said it sooner." She set down the cloth she had been folding. "Yes. In the letter, I never told you about Silas and Jer." "No, you did not." "That was wrong of me. I told myself it didn't signify. 3 men at the homestead, 1 man you were promised to. I told myself it was a small thing. I see now it was not a small thing. You stepped off that coach and saw 3 of us, and you didn't know which way to look. I'm sorry for it." He did look up then. His eyes met hers full on across the long pine table. "I won't lie to you again, Lottie. Not in any letter, not in any word, not by leaving a thing out and calling it a kindness. You have my word on that." She had not known until that moment that her hands had been carrying weight all this time. She had not known how much of her had been waiting since the day she stepped off the coach for the second shoe to fall, for the under the lie, for the husband who turned out to be a drunkie, work that turned out to be servitude, the bargain that turned out to be a trap. It was not a trap. It was a man at her table apologizing for a sin of omission 3 months old. She found that her voice would not come out steady, so she made it come out steady. "Mr. Calloway, Eli, Eli, I accept your apology, and I will say to you what I have not said to any man since my father died. I believe you." He nodded once. He drank his tea. He stood. He set the cup down. He took his hat from the peg. At the door he paused. "Lottie, yes, you're home now." He went out into the cold. She stood at the long pine table for a long time after the door closed behind him, and her hands were pressed flat against the worn wood, and she could not have said if a court of law had asked her whether she was holding herself up against the table or whether the table was holding her up. The first crisis of her life on the mountain came at the end of the 4th week. It came as such things tend to come on a mountain without warning and from the wrong direction. She had gone out alone in the late afternoon against her better judgment to gather kindling from a low stand of dead pine just above the apple trees. Silas had been at the chicken house. Elijah had been south mending fence. Jeremiah, for once, had been in the house, having taken a rare hour to clean and oil the rifles at the long table. She had told no one she was going. The kindling had only been 100 yards. The light had only just begun to soften. She had bent to lift a fallen branch when she heard the sound. Not a sound she knew, a low, slow rasp. Something heavier than a deer. Something patient. She straightened. 20 paces upslope where the timber thickened, a great gray mountain wolf stood between two pines and watched her. Its shoulders were higher than her waist. Its eyes were the color of old pewter, and they did not move from her face. Her body went cold from the inside out. She did not have the Colt. She had not thought to bring it for kindling. She took one step backward, slow, careful, the way Jeremiah had taught her with the rifle. Square shoulders, small target, no sudden movement. The wolf lowered its head a quarter-inch and took one step forward. A crack of a shot rang from the cabin porch. The wolf flinched. A second crack. A puff of pine bark exploded 6 inches above the wolf's head. A third crack, and a fourth walking the bullets closer, deliberate, missing on purpose, driving the animal upslope. The wolf turned and was gone into the timber in 3 long bounds. She stood with a dead branch in her hand and could not feel her fingers. Boots fast on the snow. Jeremiah came down the slope at a hard run, the rifle still smoking in his hand. He covered the 100 yards in a time it took her to draw 3 breaths. He did not stop when he reached her. He did not say a word. He took her by both shoulders hard, almost shaking, his face white under the sunburn, and his whiskey eyes blown wide. "You don't go out alone. You don't ever go out alone. Do you hear me, Lottie?" It was the first time he had said her name. "I hear you. You could have died. In 100 yards of your own door you could have died, and I would not have gotten here in time. You hear me. I hear you, Jer. Don't you do that to us. Don't you do that to me." His hands were still on her shoulders. He realized it. He let go fast like a man burned and stepped back. He turned half away, ran the back of his wrist across his eyes once savagely, and looked at the timber where the wolf had vanished. "Pick up your kindling," he said, voice rough. "I'll walk you back." She picked up the kindling, halfway down the slope with the cabin smoke curling soft and gold in the last of the light. She said very quietly, "Jer, yeah, thank you." He did not answer for a long moment, then almost too quiet for her to catch. "Don't make me bury another woman, Lottie. I can't do it. I've already done it once. I can't do it again." She stopped walking. He kept going for 2 more steps, and then he stopped too with his back to her, and he stood very still in the snow. "Who was she?" she asked gently. He did not turn. "Her name was Henrietta," he said after a long time. Hetty Ashford. She was my promised wife. I wasn't here when she died. 4 years come spring. And I have not in all that time to told her name to another living soul that didn't already know it." A pause. "You are the first." He started walking again. She followed. They did not speak the rest of the way down the slope, but when he opened the door of the cabin for her and she stepped inside into the warmth, his hand brushed once on purpose against the small of her back. The lightest possible touch. A man steadying a woman over a threshold. It was the first deliberate kindness Jeremiah Calloway had ever given her. It was, she understood, without needing to be told, the kind of kindness a man does not give twice if it is refused the first time. She did not refuse it. She stepped through the door and into the firelit room and did not look back. That night after supper, Silas played the violin. He had not played it in front of her before. He had played it once that she had seen alone on the porch by moonlight, and she had stood in the dark of the cabin and listened with one hand pressed against the door frame and her eyes closed. But tonight he brought the old instrument out from the cedar chest beside the hearth, and without ceremony, without a word said, he tucked it under his bearded jaw and drew the bow. The tune was Lee. It was the song she had heard him play that first secret night. She had left the words for it on his place at breakfast, 3 weeks ago, written out from memory in her own careful hand on a half sheet of paper. She had not mentioned it, neither had he. The page had simply disappeared from his place by the afternoon. He played it through once. He played it through twice. The third time very softly in a voice rougher than his speaking voice, but true to every note he sang. As the blackbird in the spring, 'neath the willow tree, sat and piped, I heard him singing Lee. Elijah at the head of the table set down his coffee cup. His face did not move, but his eyes, watching the fire, had gone soft and far. Jeremiah at the foot leaned slowly back in his chair and laid one hand over the other on the tabletop and closed his eyes. Lottie in the chair to Elijah's right, the chair that had once held a coat hook, waiting for a woman who never came, sat very still and listened. She listened to the violin and to the deep, careful voice of the middle brother and to the wind starting up again outside against the cabin walls. She thought with a clarity that surprised her, I am no longer a guest in this house. She thought, I do not know yet if I love any one of them. She thought, but I love the shape they have made together around the empty place at the table where she should have been, and around the empty place where I have come to sit instead. She thought, I will not leave this place. Whatever comes, I will not leave it. Outside in the dark, snow began to fall again over the apple trees and the silent corral and the long, rough roof of the place she had against every reasonable odd begun to call home. Inside, the violin sang, and somewhere in a fine office in Denver, a man in a gray broadcloth suit was reading by lamplight a telegram that had come up the wire that very afternoon from the assayer's office in Silverton. He read it twice. He folded it once. He laid it flat on the polished desk in front of him. He pressed his palm down on top of it as though to hold it still. Cyrus Drake did not smile. Cyrus Drake did not need to smile. The vein under the Callaway Creek had, according to the new sample run, gold at 12 ounces to the ton. 12 ounces, the whole valley end to end would be his by the spring one way or another. And 3 rough men and 1 foolish woman from Philadelphia were not going to stand in the way of that for very long. He uncapped his pen. He began in a fine, slow hand to write. The first Sunday of December came in clean and cold and bright. Lottie woke to sunlight pouring through the iron shutters in long, pale bars. Frost had drawn fern shapes across the inside of the glass. The cabin smelled of pine smoke and fresh coffee and something else, something sweet and warm she did not at first recognize. She rose. She dressed. She opened her door. Silas had baked. On the long pine table sat a pan of cinnamon biscuits, golden brown, pulled apart at the edges where they had risen against each other in the heat. Beside them a small crock of butter, a tag of last summer's honey, 3 places set, and a small folded note in Silas's slanted hand propped against the sugar bowl. Lottie, Eli rode south to fetch the preacher, Hendricks, for service this afternoon. Jurors at the chicken house. I have gone to walk the trap lines. Eat, rest. We will be home by midday. S. She stood in the warm room with a note in her hand for a long moment. 6 weeks ago, she had been a stranger sleeping with a bolted door. 6 weeks ago, her name had not been spoken in this house. Now there were biscuits on the table and a note in her own honor, and the fire built up against the cold, and three men in three different directions had each in his own quiet way made the morning ready for her before going out into the snow. She sat, she ate, she poured a second cup of coffee. She listened to the wood pop in the stove and to the slow breath of the cabin and to the great silence of the high country beyond the walls. She was happy. She had not in any honest moment since her father's burial expected to be happy again. She had expected to survive. She had expected in the best of her quiet hopes to be safe. She had not expected this. The biscuit warm in her hand, the note in her lap, the certainty somewhere under her ribs that three men who had been alone for years had begun to arrange the small details of their days around the fact of her. She was still sitting at the table, the note still in her lap, when she heard the horses on the trail. Two riders, coming hard. The biscuit dropped from her hand back to the plate. Two riders on a Sunday morning at full gait on a trail that ended at this homestead and went nowhere else. She knew before she had reached the window, before she had pushed back the curtain, before she had seen them, that this was not Elijah returning early. She crossed to the rifle on its pegs above the door. She took it down. She checked the chamber the way Jeremiah had taught her. She set it across the table within easy reach. She put on her bear coat. She opened the door. Two men reined up in front of the porch. The lead rider was tall, lean as a whip. He wore a long gray broadcloth coat, too clean for the trail, and a flat-brimmed black hat and a pair of gloves of fine kid leather. His face was clean-shaven. His eyes were the cold, pale gray of slate before rain. The horse beneath him was of fine bay, too good for this country. The man behind him was a different breed. Heavy-set, black-bearded, a sawed-off shotgun across the saddle bow under one large gloved hand. Eyes on her the moment she stepped onto the porch. The lead rider lifted his hat. "Ma'am, I beg your pardon for the intrusion on a Sabbath morning. My name is Cyrus Drake. I represent the Drake Mining Company of Denver. I have a business with Mr. Elijah Calloway. Is he to home?" She had her hand on the door frame. She kept it there. "Mr. Calloway is not at home, sir. He is expected by midday. You are welcome to wait in the yard or to ride to the south where you will meet him on the trail." Drake smiled. It was a small smile. It did not reach the slate of his eyes. "You are Miss Bellamy, I believe." She did not answer. "News travels quickly in a country with so few people in it, ma'am. A young lady of Philadelphia of fine breeding traveling alone to Silverton. There was talk in town. I confess I did not believe it until this moment." "Mr. Drake, my affairs are not your business. Mr. Calloway will be home at midday." "Of course." He inclined his head. "Of course, forgive me. It is only that the country here is harsh, ma'am, very harsh. A young woman of your refinement, your education, your evident health is wasted in such a place. I trust the Calloway brothers have made the dangers plain to you." His eyes moved very slightly past her shoulder to the open cabin door and to the great room behind her and to the rifle she had placed on the table. He saw it. She knew he saw it. His smile did not change. "They have been very plain, Mr. Drake. I am glad to hear it. I have come today to make Mr. Calloway a generous offer for this property. $50,000, a figure that I think you will agree would buy a most pleasant home in Denver, with paved streets, with heated rooms, with a society more suited to a lady of your particular qualities than this rough valley. I had hoped to discuss it with him directly. I will return another day." He paused. He let his eyes rest on her face. "It is a great pity, Miss Bellamy, when a flower of your delicacy is asked to bloom in soil so unforgiving. Accidents happen on the frontier. Sickness, jury, wolves, bad weather. A young woman of your refinement, far from any doctor, far from any neighbor, in a cabin, with only 3 men who must by necessity leave her alone for long hours of the day. The mind shudders, ma'am. It truly does. The bearded man behind him shifted his weight in the saddle. The shotgun across his lap moved with him half an inch, no more. She felt the cold come up through the boards under her boots and into her spine. She did not move. Mr. Drake, ma'am, you will turn your horses now. You will ride down off this mountain. You will deliver any message you have for Mr. Calloway through the Silverton store by letter like a gentleman. And you will not, while I am living and breathing in this house, set foot on the porch of Calloway Hollow again. Do you understand me, sir? A small flicker this time in the slate gray eyes. It was the look of a man who had not expected from a young woman alone on a porch the same flat, unmovable refusal he might have heard from her husband. As you wish, Miss Bellamy. He touched his hat brim, he turned his fine bay. The bearded man followed. They rode out of the yard at a slow and deliberate pace, neither hurrying nor lingering, like 2 men who had come to measure a thing and were satisfied with their measure. She watched them until they were past the apple trees, past the bend in the trail, past the last place she could see them through the dark trunks of the timber. Then her knees gave out, and she sat down hard on the porch step and put her face against her drawn-up knees, and she breathed slow and deliberate until she was sure she was not going to be sick. Elijah was home an hour earlier than she had expected him. He had met Drake on the trail and had not, as she half feared, he would turned and ridden after him. He had let the man pass. He had let the man ride. So he had, when the bay and the bearded shotgun had vanished around the southern bend, kicked his own horse into a long, hard gallop up the trail to the homestead, and he had come up the yard at a full speed with his rifle across his saddle bow, calling her name before he had even reached the porch. Lottie, she came out the door. He was already off the horse, taking the steps 2 at a time. Lottie, are you hurt? I am not hurt. Did he set foot in the house? He did not. He stopped on the porch in front of her. He did not touch her. He looked her over once head to foot like a man checking livestock for injury. Then his shoulders, which had been held up like a man bracing for a blow, came slowly back down. He let out a long breath. He took off his hat and pressed the back of his glove against his eyes for one short moment and put the hat back on. Tell me, he said. She told him. She told him every word the man had said. The compliments. The threats inside the compliments. The horse too fine for the country. The shotgun across the saddle bow of the second man. The $50,000. The mention of accidents. The mention of wolves. Elijah listened without interrupting. When she was done, he stood for a long time looking out over the apple trees, the muscle along his jaw working slow. He'll come back, he said. I know. Not him, not in person. He said his piece. Now he sends men. Eli. I know, Lottie. We need to talk to Silas and Jer, the 4 of us, tonight. He turned his head. He looked at her. The lines at the corners of his eyes softened just a little, just for her. Yes, ma'am, the 4 of us, tonight. The 4 of them sat at the long pine table after supper, and Elijah laid Drake out for them in plain words. Silas listened with his hands folded around his coffee cup. Jeremiah listened with his elbows on the table and his chin on his interlaced fingers and a long, slow fire building at the back of his eyes. Neither brother interrupted. When Elijah was done, Silas spoke first. Eli, the vein. I know. You always said there was nothing under that creek. There was nothing in 74. There was nothing in 76. There's been a man with a rocker and a pan working that lower bend in the dark for the past 3 months, And I've been finding the prints in the mud and washing them out with my own boots before either of you could see them, because I did not want to start a thing I could not finish. A long silence. Jeremiah leaned slowly back in his chair. You knew Eli. I suspected. You suspected and you did not say. I did not say. While Lottie was riding 3 days through that country to come up here, while Drake was already moving on us, you did not say. Jer, you did not say Eli. I would have told you tonight. I would have told you tonight whether Drake had ridden in this morning or not. I had decided coming back from Silverton with the preacher. I was going to tell the three of you tonight. I swear it on our mother's grave. Jeremiah was quiet for a long time. Then in a voice so soft it was almost not there, he said, there is something I have not said either. All three of them turned to him. He looked down at the worn surface of the long pine table at the pale circle where 1,000 cups had been set down over 4 years, and he began. Hetty did not die in a kitchen accident. The fire that killed Hetty was set. Silas closed his eyes. Lottie beside Elijah did not move. I have known for 3 years and 7 months. I found the lamp oil tin behind the burned-out wall of the cabin 2 weeks after we put her in the ground. Tin none of us had bought. Tin none of us kept. I rode that tin down to Silverton and asked the dry goods clerk who he had sold it to, and the clerk would not say a word. And the next day the clerk was gone south on the morning coach and never came back. I asked every man in that town who would speak to me. I asked drovers. I asked the assayer. I asked the saloon keeper. I drank too much. I made enemies. I learned 3 things. He drew in a slow breath. 1, there were 2 men hired out of Pueblo that summer by a 3rd man to come up here and encourage the Calloway brothers to sell. 2, they were not paid by any company name on any paper anywhere. They were paid in silver coin in person by a tall, lean man in a gray broadcloth coat. 3, the 3rd man's name on the lips of 2 different mouths in 2 different bunk rooms was Drake. He lifted his head. I have carried this for 3 years and 7 months. I did not tell you Eli because I knew the moment I told you you would ride to Denver and you would find him and you would hang yourself for him in front of a federal judge. I did not tell you Silas because you would have followed Eli and we would have buried 2 more brothers and there would have been nobody left on this mountain at all. I told myself I would gather more proof. I told myself I would wait. I told myself there would be a clean way. And every year that I did not act, that man got richer and bigger and more careful and harder to reach. And tonight he has put his hand on Lottie's porch. He looked at Lottie. I am sorry, ma'am. I am sorry I have brought this to your door. She rose from her chair. She walked the length of the table. She put her hand on his shoulder. He did not look up. Jeremiah Calloway, she said, you did not bring this to my door. He brought this to my door and to your door and to Hetty's door before mine nearly 4 years ago. You have carried a thing that was not yours alone to carry. That ends tonight. Do you hear me? That ends tonight. His shoulders shook once under her hand. I hear you, Lottie. Eli. Yes. I have written in my life perhaps 300 letters. To family, to my father's medical correspondence, to gentlemen of the bar in Philadelphia who did business with my father. There is a man named Augustus Harrington who sat at my father's deathbed and wept, who is now a justice on the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania. There is a man named Cornelius McKean who was at Yale with my father, who is now a senator of the United States. These are not idle names. These men knew my father. These men owe my father in the ledger of their own consciences a great deal. If I write to them with what Jeremiah has told us and with what Drake has said on this porch this very morning, and with my own hand under my own seal, those letters will be opened. They will be read. They will be acted upon. She turned slowly and looked at the three brothers in turn. You are mountain men, she said. You are not lawyers. You are not senators. You will not win this fight in Denver with a rifle. Cyrus Drake will eat you alive in a federal courtroom in Denver. He has the suit, he has the lawyer, he has the lie ready. What he does not have, what he cannot buy, is the personal mail of a Philadelphia doctor's daughter to two men who loved her father. That gentleman is what I bring to this table. A long silence. Silas reached across and laid his big calloused hand over hers. Lottie. Yes, Silas. You bring more than that to this table. But that by itself is more than any of us have brought in 4 years. We will write the letters tonight. Elijah nodded once, slowly, like a man who has finally laid down a load he did not know he had been carrying alone. We write tonight, he said. Jer rides for Silverton at first light. He puts those letters on the eastbound coach himself. He does not stop. He does not speak to a soul on the way down. He is back here by sundown tomorrow. Jeremiah lifted his head. Yes. And while he is gone, Silas and I will not leave this porch, either of us, for any reason. Lottie does not step off this porch without one of us within 10 paces. We sleep in shifts. We light no lantern at the windows after dark. We feed the stock at staggered times. We do not give him a clean shot at any of us, not at any hour until Jer is back. Yes. And when Jer is back, we wait. We let those letters move. We let the law come to us. We do not ride to Denver. We do not go looking for him. We let him come to us where we know the ground, where we have walls, where we have her. He turned his head just slightly toward Lottie, where we have all of us. The first letter was finished before midnight, the second by 2 in the morning, the third a long, careful one to Senator McKean by the cold gray hour just before first light. Lottie sealed each one with a candle and her father's old brass seal that had come west in her trunk, the seal he had used on every bottle he had ever sent home with a patient. The wax was the dark red of dried blood. The mark it left was a small, clean B, raised and proud. She handed the 3 sealed letters to Jeremiah at the door before dawn. He stood on the porch in his long oilskin, with his saddlebags already over his shoulder, his rifle on a sling at his back, the smaller pistol in his belt, his hat pulled low. He was a man going to war on a coach line, and he knew it. Jar, Lottie, you come back to us. I will come back. Promise it, out loud, like a man keeps his word. He looked at her for a long second. I promise, Lottie. On Hetty's grave, on my brother's lives, on yours, I will come back. He swung up onto the dark gelding Silas had saddled for him in the yard. He did not look at the cabin again. He turned the horse south, kicked it into a hard trot, and went down the trail through the standing timber, and was gone before the first true light had touched the eastern peaks of the San Juans. He was supposed to be home by sundown. He was not home by sundown. The first day, Silas said, storm's working in. He may have laid up at the preacher's place. It's the right thing to do in a wind like this. He has good sense. Lottie nodded. The second day, the snow began. It came not in flakes, but in walls. Whole walls of it advancing across the valley out of the northwest gray sheets falling against gray cliffs. By mid-morning, the apple trees were lost. By noon, the corral was lost. By 2 in the afternoon, the barn 50 yards from the cabin door could not be seen. The wind came up under the eaves with a long, low animal sound she had never heard a wind make before. The shutters rattled. The chimney drew unsteady. The fire in the iron stove had to be fed every 20 minutes against the cold pulling down its throat. Elijah came in from the corral at dusk with his beard solid white and a small calf wrapped inside his coat against his chest. The cow had calved early. The mother was struggling. 2 heifers were missing entirely from the count drifted somewhere in the white wall. "I have to go for them," he said. Silas at the stove did not turn. "Eli." "They won't last the night, Silas. Both of them are bagged up. They're due any day. We lose those 2 and the calves they carry, we lose the spring. We lose the spring, the homestead don't make a profit this year. And if Drake's lawyers come at us on a tax claim before the senator's letter does its work, that profit is what saves the deed. Eli, I'm going. Then I go with you." "No, you stay with Lottie Uso. You do not leave this porch. You hear me. You do not leave this porch. If I am not back by full dark, you do not come after me. You wait for first light. You hear me, Silas." A long pause. "I hear you." Lottie stepped between them. "Eli, look at me." He looked at her. "Come back," she said. It was all she said. He nodded once. He set the calf down by the stove. He pulled his beard down, tightened his coat, drew his glove on, with his teeth picked up a coil of rope and a lantern and went out the door. The snow swallowed him in 3 steps. The clock on the mantel read 7 minutes past 5. Silas put more wood in the stove. Lottie sat at the long pine table with her hands folded in front of her and watched the door. She watched it for an hour. She watched it for 2. The little calf by the stove stopped shivering and slept. Silas walked the length of the cabin once every 10 minutes, looking out each window in turn, saying nothing. The wind rose. The wind fell. The wind rose again. At 8, the wind began to scream. At 9, Silas lit the second lantern, the big one, the one with the polished brass reflector that they kept for finding lost stock, and he set it in the front window of the cabin and turned the wick up high, and that lantern threw a long, pale beam out into the white wall. It did not pierce 6 feet, but it would, if Elijah were near, be a thing he could walk toward. Lottie stood up. She crossed to the window. She put her hand against the cold glass. "You're home now," she said very quietly to nobody at all. "Eli Calloway, you are home now. Come home." Silas at the stove said nothing. At 10 minutes after midnight, Silas went out. He went without telling her. He went the way Elijah had gone, with a rope tied around his waist and the other end of the rope tied to the porch rail. And he was gone for 18 minutes, and he came back through the door, white as a ghost, with his own beard sheeted in ice, and he said only, "No tracks, no tracks, anywhere. The winds filled them. He could be 20 feet from the porch, and we wouldn't see him." Lottie did not cry. She had decided somewhere in the second hour that she was not going to cry. She put more water on the stove. She set out bandages and warm blankets. She brought the cook pot to a low simmer with broth in it. She laid out the small medical bag her father had given her on her 16th birthday, the bag that had crossed 2,000 miles in a Philadelphia trunk and had not been opened once on this mountain. She lifted from it her father's stethoscope, his thermometer, his case of suture needles, the small dark bottle of laudanum he had labeled in his own neat hand. She would be ready. She would be ready when he came through that door, because he was going to come through that door. She would not allow any other outcome. It was 3 in the morning when she heard the first scratch on the door. It was not a knock. A knock requires a closed fist and the strength to lift it. This was a scratch, soft, slow, like an animal asking to be let in. Silas was already up. He had the door open before she had crossed the room. Elijah Calloway fell forward into the cabin. He fell across the threshold at full length, face down, with his great coat solid as armor with frozen ice, and his beard a single white block, and his lips the color of slate. Behind him on a long line of rope, two heavy red heifers plastered white stamped and blue on the porch boards. Behind the heifers, half dragging on the rope, a third length of cord was tied to a small bundled thing in the snow that when Silas lifted it proved to be a newborn calf alive, just barely wrapped in the inside of Elijah's own shirt. Silas got the calf. Silas got the heifers into the lee of the porch. Silas dragged his brother by the shoulders into the cabin and kicked the door shut against the wind. Lottie had not moved from where her father's bag lay open on the table. Now she moved. She moved exactly the way her father had taught her through 15 years of moving beside him with her hands and her breath, and her mind all working at once, and her fear locked away in a small back room of her chest. Silas, the shears, from the bag. Cut the coat off him. Do not pull. Cut. The fabric is frozen to the shirt. Cut the shirt as well. Cut everything down to the long underwear and stop there. I will not have him stripped to bare skin in this cold. It will kill him. Now bring the warm blankets from the chest. Bring 3 in. Lay one under him. Wrap one around the trunk, only not the limbs, not yet. Do you hear me, Silas? Not the limbs. I hear you, Lottie. Now feed the fire all the way up. We need this room over 80 degrees by full dawn. She knelt beside Elijah. She felt the pus at his throat. It was slow, 38 to the minute. She felt the pulse at his wrist. She could not find it. She lifted his eyelid. The pupil was wide and slow to react. She set her cheek over his mouth. He was breathing, shallow, thready, but he was breathing. Eli Calloway, you can hear me. You stay with me. Do you understand? You stay with me. You do not leave this room. She had not in any moment of her life until this one used her father's voice. The voice he used at deathbeds. The voice that pulled men back across a line they had already started to step over. She had never used it. She had not known she had it. She used it now. Eli, squeeze my hand if you hear me. For one terrible second, nothing. Then very faintly, his fingers moved against hers. She put her forehead down against the back of his cold, cracked hand for one beat of her own heart, no more, and then she lifted it again. Silas, warm broth, a spoonful at a time. I will sit him up against my knee. We do not warm the limbs. We warm the core. Do you understand? The core. Hot water bottles wrapped in cloth against the chest and the belly. Not the hands, not the feet. If we warm the hands and feet first, the cold blood from the limbs will rush back to his heart and stop it. Do you hear me, Silas? I hear you, Lottie. Then we work. They worked through the rest of the night. They worked the way her father had worked, the way a doctor's daughter had been raised to work, the way a man's middle brother, who had never given up on him once in 32 years, would always work. Spoon by spoon, cloth by cloth, breath by breath. The wind screamed against the cabin walls. The fire roared in the iron stove. The little calf by the hearth slept against the warm bricks and lived. At some hour she could not name, she realized she was crying. She did not stop her hands. She let the tears fall onto the back of his hand where she gripped it. They did not freeze there. The room was warm enough now that they did not freeze. When the first gray of morning came thin and unreal through the iron shutters, Elijah Calloway opened his eyes. He did not speak at first. He looked up at the ceiling beams slowly as if confirming where he was. He looked at the iron stove. He looked at the calf asleep on the bricks. He looked at his brother sitting in the chair by his head, holding a cooling enamel cup of broth. He looked last at Lottie. She was kneeling on the floor beside him, her honey blonde hair fallen entirely loose down her shoulders, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, her hands raw and red from hot water and cold water and hot water again, her father's stethoscope still around her neck. He looked at her for a long time. His lips moved. She bent her ear close. Lottie, I'm here, Eli. I came home. You came home. You called me home. I did. He closed his eyes again, but his hand this time found hers on the blanket and closed around it and did not let go. Outside, the wind began at last to ease. The storm was passing, but it was not over. None of it was over. Cyrus Drake was still in his fine office in Denver. The letters were still moving east on a slow coach line. Jeremiah Calloway was still somewhere on the South Road, in unknown weather, alive or not alive. No man in this cabin yet knew. And the longest night of Charlotte Bellamy's life on the mountain had ended. The longest day of it had not yet begun. The third day was the day Jeremiah came home. He came home not on his own horse, but on a borrowed gray mule, and he came home not at sundown, but at the slow gray hour just after first light, when the snow had stopped and the world was a sheet of white silence broken only by the cold smoke rising from the chimney. Lottie was at the front window. She had not slept. She had been at the window since Elijah had fallen asleep at last, holding her hand from his pallet by the stove, and she had watched the trail south the way a woman watches a candle flame she does not dare to let go out. She saw the dark shape come around the bend in the timber. She saw the shape was a mule, and on the mule was a man, and the man was hunched low over the animal's neck with his arms wrapped around its mane. She did not call to Silas. She did not need to. Silas was already at her shoulder. It's Jer, she said. It's Jer. They went out into the cold without their coats. Jeremiah slid off the mule into Silas's arms before he had quite reined it up. There was dried blood frozen down one side of his oilskin. There was a long, shallow gash on his cheekbone, scabbed over now that he had not bothered to clean. His lips were cracked. His eyes were red and far. But he was alive. He was on his feet, and he was holding against his chest under 3 layers of button coat a small leather wallet that was not his own. Lottie put her arms around him. She did not care that he was bloody. She did not care that he stank of horse sweat and frostbite and 3 days of fear. She put her arms around him and she held him, and she felt his whole long frame shake once hard and then settle. You came back, she said. I told you I would. You did. You did. Silas got him inside. Silas got the mule into the lee of the porch with a blanket thrown across its back. Silas put coffee into Jeremiah's hand and the chair by the stove under him, and only then, when the worst of the cold was off him, did Jeremiah open the leather wallet on his knee and lay it flat on the long pine table. Inside were 3 things: a folded receipt from the eastbound coach line stamped and dated, signed for 3 sealed letters bearing the wax mark of a small, clean B. A telegram, already opened, from Senator Cornelius McKean of Washington City, sent care of the Silverton General's Store, addressed to Miss Charlotte Bellamy, and a bank draft folded once in the amount of $200 drawn on the First National Bank of Philadelphia, signed in the name of Justice Augustus Harrington. Lottie picked up the telegram first. Her hands were shaking. She did not try to hide it. She read it once silently. She read it again. Then she sat down very slowly in the chair across from Jeremiah, and she pressed both hands flat against the surface of the long pine table to steady herself. Read it out, Lottie. Her voice when it came was steady. She had not known until that moment that she could make her voice steady on demand, but she could. Miss Bellamy, stop. Letters received and read, stop. Have spoken at length to Justice Harrington and to Attorney General's office, stop. Federal marshals departing Denver this morning under sealed warrants, stop. Drake to be taken into custody on charges of mail fraud, criminal conspiracy, and arson resulting in the death of one Henrietta Ashford, 1875, stop. Hold position. Trust no rider not in marshal's coat. Will telegraph again when matter concluded. Your father was the finest man I ever knew. Stop. McKean. The cabin was very quiet for a long moment. Then Silas at the stove set down his coffee cup with a small, careful click and pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes. He named her, Silas said. What, the senator? He named Hetty, by her own true name, in a federal cable. Jeremiah looked up, his eyes red and worn as they had filled. He named her Eli. Jeremiah's voice cracked once on the name. After 3 years and 7 months, somebody outside this cabin finally named her, in writing, with charges to follow. From the pallet by the stove, Elijah's voice came rough and slow, the voice of a man speaking from a long way off. Read it again, Lottie. She read it again. When she was done, Elijah let out a long breath that seemed to come from the bottom of him, and he closed his eyes, and a single tear ran down the side of his face into the gray of his beard, and he did not wipe it away. He had not, she understood, in all the years she would later come to know him, ever wept where any man could see him, not at his mother's grave, not at his father's, not over Cordelia alone in the barn with his head in his hands. He had not wept. He had not allowed it. And now on a pallet by an iron stove in a cabin in the San Juan Mountains with a federal telegram on a long pine table beside him, he wept once quietly while the woman from Philadelphia and his 2 brothers pretended out of love not to see. Then he opened his eyes. He looked at Jeremiah. Tell us how you got it, Jeremiah told them. He had made Silverton on the 2nd day sundown. He had put the 3 letters on the eastbound coach with his own hand, watched them locked in the iron mailbox, watched the coach pull out of the yard. He had ridden back the way he came, 2 miles south of the Homestead Trail where the road forked and the timber closed in tight. 4 men had come out of the trees on him, hired men, not Drake himself. Drake hired better than that. 2 from Pueblo, 1 from Denver and from somewhere east. They had not been waiting for him by chance. They had been waiting for the man who had been seen in town with 3 sealed letters. He had killed 2 of them. He had taken a long, shallow cut along the cheekbone and a worse one across the meat of his upper arm, and he had killed 2 of them, and the other 2 had run, and he had been left bleeding on a frozen road with a horse that had taken a bullet through the lung and would not live the hour. He had walked 5 miles in the beginning of the storm in the dark until he had come to the preacher Hendrix's place. The preacher had taken him in. The preacher's wife had stitched the cheekbone and the arm. They had kept him through the worst of the weather, and when the snow had broken on the 3rd day, the preacher had given him the gray mule and the leather wallet that Senator McKean's first telegram had been waiting in for him at the store, and had said only, "Go home, son. Tell that lady from Philadelphia that the Lord moves slow, but he moves true." Lottie put her hand over Jeremiah's hand on the table. You killed 2 men for those letters. I'd kill 4 for them, Lottie. I'd kill 10. You will not have to. No, he said. I do not believe I will. The federal marshals reached Denver 3 days after the telegram was sent. They reached the offices of the Drake Mining Company at 9:30 on a Tuesday morning, with sealed warrants in a leather portfolio and 12 uniformed deputies behind them on the polished marble steps. They did not knock. They did not announce themselves to the clerk at the front desk. They walked in their long blue coats and their badged hats past 3 rooms of bookkeepers who stopped writing and watched, and they entered the inner office of Cyrus Drake without removing their hats. Drake was at his desk. Drake had a pen in his hand. Drake looked up, saw the badges, saw the warrants in the lead marshal's hand, saw the 12 deputies behind, and a small thing happened to his face that the lead marshal would later describe in a sworn deposition as the look of a man watching the bottom drop out of a long, careful lie. He did not run. There was nowhere to run to. He set the pen down very carefully in the inkwell. He folded his hands on the desk. He said in a voice that was not quite his own, "Gentlemen, there has, I think, been some misunderstanding." The lead marshal said, "Mr. Drake, there has not." He read the warrants aloud. Mail fraud, criminal conspiracy, bribery of federal land officers, hiring of paid arsonists in the death of one Henrietta Ashford of Silverton, Colorado in the spring of 1875, attempted murder by paid riders of one Jeremiah Calloway of San Juan County, Colorado in the December just past, attempted intimidation by personal threat of one Charlotte Bellamy of Callaway Hollow in the same December. The list went on. The list was longer than Drake had imagined in his fine office with the polished desk that anything would ever be. When the lead marshal was done, Drake said only, "I would like to send for my attorney." "You may," the marshal said. "From the federal jail in Denver, we will hold you there until the spring assizes. The attorney general has personally requested the case. You will be tried in federal court, Mr. Drake, by a jury of 12 men who have never set foot in your bank, never drunk your liquor, never owed you a favor, and never heard your name before in their lives. This may be a new experience for you, sir." Drake stood up. He let them put the irons on him. He walked out through the 3 rooms of bookkeepers who had all stopped writing, and down the marble steps and into the closed black wagon waiting at the curb. The wagon door shut behind him with the small, definite sound of a door that is not for a long while going to open again. Word reached Callaway Hollow on the 17th of December by a federal courier riding a fresh horse and carrying a second telegram, this one shorter than the first. Drake in custody stop. Trial scheduled May stop. Witnesses to be summoned in due course stop. Stand down, Senator McKean. Lottie read it, once set it down on the long pine table and put her face in her hands and laughed. Once a single broken laugh before she covered her mouth and was still. Elijah, sitting up in the bed now, watching her from across the room, said quietly, "Lottie." "Eli." "Stand down." He says, "Stand down." "Yes, Eli." He says, "Stand down." "I don't know how to stand down." She crossed the room. She sat on the edge of the bed beside him. She took his hand in both of hers. "You have stood up, my love, every day since you were a boy. Every day for everyone you have ever cared for your brothers, for Cordelia even when she was already gone, for Hetty even when you did not know what had been done, for me before you had ever laid eyes on me. You have stood up, Eli Calloway, until you nearly froze to death standing up. And now a senator of the United States is telling you to stand down. So you will stand down. You will sit on this bed. You will let me feed you broth. You will let your brothers run the place a few weeks longer. You will let me be the one who stands up for a season. Do you hear me?" He looked at her for a long moment. The corner of his mouth moved. "Yes, ma'am." "Lottie." "Yes, ma'am, Lottie." She bent her forehead down to his and she stayed there for one long, quiet breath, And outside the cabin, the high mountain valley lay clean and white and unbothered for the first time in many years. The preacher, Obadiah Hendricks, rode up the trail to Callaway Hollow on the second Sunday of April, with the snow gone in patches off the south slopes and the first green on the cottonwoods along the creek, and his thin, dark-haired wife Prudence riding behind him on a second horse and a small leather case strapped behind her saddle that contained, among other things, the Book of Common Prayer his grandfather had carried out of Tennessee in 1818. He had ridden up to perform a wedding. He found 4 people on the porch waiting for him. Elijah Calloway on his feet, now thinner than he had been in November, but standing straight, his beard newly trimmed for the first time in 5 years, wearing the dark wool suit his father had been buried in, brushed clean and altered at the shoulders by Lottie's careful needle. Silas Calloway, in a cream-colored shirt with a bolo tie at the throat and a small blue wildflower pinned at his lapel, his violin case at his feet on the porch boards. Jeremiah Calloway, the long pink scar still showing on his cheekbone, in his best shirt and a black string tie, his thumb hooked in his belt at the old familiar angle, and his whiskey amber eyes red-rimmed and bright. And Lottie. Lottie in the crimson red traveling dress she had worn off the stagecoach in November, freshly cleaned, and pressed the torn hem invisibly mended, her honey blonde hair pinned up in a soft Victorian crown that her mother had taught her to do at 13 and that she had not done in 3 years. The gold cameo brooch of her mother was at her throat. The pearl earrings of her mother were at her ears. On the third finger of her left hand she wore a thin gold band that Elijah had ridden 2 days down to Silverton in March, in the worst of the late winter mud, to fetch from the merchant who had once sold him the green tin of tea. The preacher dismounted. He looked at the 4 of them on the porch. He looked at the long pine table that had been carried out into the yard and set under the largest of the 5 apple trees, which was on this Sunday in April just beginning to bud at its highest branches, with small white blossoms not yet quite open. He looked at the small fire of pine cones burning in a stone bowl on the table. He looked at Lottie. He looked next at Elijah. "Well," said the preacher, Obadiah Hendricks, in the voice of a man who had been waiting a long time for this particular ride, "I see no need to delay." It was the simplest wedding the San Juan Mountains had ever seen. Silas played orally on the violin, while the preacher's wife, Prudence Hendricks, walked Lottie the short 20 paces from the cabin door to the apple tree on the arm, not of any father, but of Jeremiah Calloway, who had laid his pistol aside on the porch rail, and who walked her with the slow, careful steps of a man giving away the most precious thing he had ever helped to keep alive. He stopped at the table. He turned to her. He said quietly, only for her, in the voice he had used when he had taught her to fire her first pistol at 30 paces. "Square shoulders, Lottie. Half a breath out. Squeeze." She laughed once despite the tears already on her face. "Yes, Jer." He gave her hand to Elijah. Elijah took her hand the way a man takes a thing he has already understood in his bones will be the last thing he ever takes. The preacher read the old words. They were the same old words 100 and 1,000 and 10,000 other men and women on this continent had said to one another in cabins and churches and tents and sod houses for 250 years. To have, to hold, from this day forward, for better, for worse, in sickness, in health, till death us do part. Lottie said the words. Elijah said the words. When the preacher said, "By the authority vested in me by the Methodist Episcopal Church and the laws of the state of Colorado, I now pronounce you husband and wife." And when Elijah leaned down and kissed her, it was the simplest kiss any of them had ever seen. A man bending to a woman in the late afternoon sun under a budding apple tree in a high mountain valley, and the woman lifting her face to him without hesitation, and the kiss itself a quiet thing, a promise sealed where both of them could feel it and where neither of them had any further need to perform it for the watching world. Silas drew his bow across the violin. Aura Lee rose into the high cold blue of the Colorado sky. The preacher's wife, Prudence Hendricks, who had ridden 35 miles to be there, and who would ride 35 back before sundown, wept openly into her handkerchief and was not ashamed. Jeremiah Calloway, the youngest brother, who had not allowed himself to cry at any wedding, since the wedding that had never happened, sat down hard on the porch step, with his head in his hands and his shoulders shaking, and Silas laid the violin aside long enough to walk over and put one hand on the back of his brother's neck and squeeze and then go back and pick up the bow and finish the song. That night, after the preacher and his wife had ridden away with full bellies and the long good wishes of every Calloway in the hollow, after Silas and Jeremiah had taken their lanterns out to their own bedrolls in the loft of the barn, after the little calf from December, who was now a long-legged red yearling, had been bedded down in the stall after the supper dishes had been washed and dried and put away on their proper shelves and the fire in the iron stove banked low for the night, Elijah Calloway took down a small wood-handled chisel from the toolbox above the hearth and a hammer, and he stepped out onto the porch. Lottie watched him from inside. He carved into the heavy pine of the doorframe in slow, careful strokes 4 characters, E+C/1879. Below the date in smaller letters with the deeper care of a man who was not in any hurry, he carved 3 more words. Built this together. When he came back inside, he blew the wood dust off his hands, hung the chisel back in its place, and crossed the room to her. He did not speak. He took her hand. He led her to the door of her room, the room with the bolt she had not locked since November, the room with the iron hook beside the door, where her bare coat now hung as though it had always belonged to that exact piece of iron. He paused in the doorway. He looked down at her. The whiskey-amber eyes were very steady and very tired and very kind. He stepped through. He closed the door softly behind them. Outside in the high mountain valley, the apple trees stood pale with new blossom. Under a sky strewn with stars too thick to count, and a thin sliver of new spring moon hung above the western cliffs, and far below in the timber, an owl called once and was answered. Inside, the rest of the night belonged to no one but the 2 of them. By morning, the bolt on the bedroom door had been quietly removed from its bracket and would not be reattached in any year or any season for the rest of her life on the mountain. The first letter from her old life arrived in May. It was from Justice Augustus Harrington on the heavy cream paper of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, and it informed her in his careful old man's hand that the federal trial of one Cyrus Drake had concluded on the 14th of May. He had been found guilty on all counts by a jury of 12 men. He had been sentenced to 30 years in the federal penitentiary at Detroit. He would not see daylight, the justice wrote, in any free sense of the word again in his natural life. The Drake Mining Company had been seized by federal receivers. Its assets were being distributed to the families of those it had wronged. The Calloway brothers and Mrs. Charlotte Calloway would receive in due course a settlement of some $12,000, which would be deposited at the First National Bank of Philadelphia in her name against any future need of the family. Lottie read the letter to all 3 brothers at the long pine table. When she was done, Jeremiah said quietly, $12,000. Yes. What do you mean to do with it, sister? She had not heard him call her sister before. She set the letter down. She thought a long moment. I will set aside $2,000 for the children when they come. I will give 2,000 to Reverend Hendricks and his wife who saved your life on a snow road in December. I will set aside 1,000 for a schoolhouse in the lower meadow where any child within 30 miles may come and be taught letters and figures by me free of charge beginning when the snow goes off next spring. The rest stays in the bank and we do not touch it except as the homestead requires. Elijah beside her simply nodded. Silas said, "A schoolhouse. A schoolhouse, Silas. My mother taught me my letters at our kitchen table, Lottie, from the same Bible that sits on your shelf. Then you and I will teach together when you have an hour to spare from the cabin." "Yes, ma'am," Jeremiah said, "and what shall I do?" "You, Jer, will do what you have done since November. You will teach any child who comes to that schoolhouse and any wife who comes after them how to fire a colt at 30 paces square shoulders, half a breath out squeeze. And you will keep our daughters alive when the day comes the way you kept me alive 100 yards from my own door." He looked away. He nodded once. He did not speak again that evening. But when he rose to go out to the barn for the night, he stopped at her chair and he laid his large calloused hand briefly on her shoulder, and he squeezed once and went out into the spring night without a word. The summer came on hot and green. The 5 apple trees that had been carried as saplings out of Virginia by the brother's father long years before and replanted in this hollow by Elijah's own hand when he had broken the ground in 1874, set fruit in numbers Elijah had never seen. By August, the boughs were heavy with small green apples that would ripen red by September. The garden Lottie had laid out behind the cabin in March on a square of ground broken by Silas's spade and Jeremiah's hands came in thick with corn and beans and squash and tomatoes and 3 kinds of pepper. The cattle grew fat on the high meadows. The newborn calves of December, all 3 of them ran the long pasture on legs grown long and strong. In late July, Lottie told Elijah on the porch in the evening that she was carrying a child. He went very still. He did not speak for a long minute. Then he said in a voice that was rough at the edges, "When February, Reverend Hendricks's wife, who was a midwife in Boston before she married him, says February. February. Yes." He pulled her in against his chest, and he held her there, and he did not say another word for a long time. When he finally did speak into her hair, it was only this, "I do not deserve you, Charlotte Calloway." "You do, you did. You always did, Eli. I love you. I know. I love you, Lottie. I know my love. I have known since November." In February, in a heavy snowfall, not unlike the one that had nearly taken Elijah a year before with Prudence Hendricks at the foot of the bed, and Silas at the kitchen stove keeping water on the boil, and Jeremiah pacing the long pine floor of the great room from end to end like a wolf in a barn, Theodore Tobias Calloway came into the world. He came in red-faced and roaring at 4 in the morning. Elijah, who had been in the bedroom the whole time, who had not let go of her hand through any of it, took the boy in his great calloused hands, and he laid him against his bare chest under the blanket, and he wept openly this time where any man who cared to look could see him. Jeremiah came in quiet from the kitchen. He stopped at the foot of the bed. He looked down at the small, dark-haired thing breathing against his brother's chest. "Theodore," he said. "Theodore," Lottie said, "after my father, Tobias was my father's name. We will give the boy both. Theodore Tobias Calloway." "Yes." Jeremiah swallowed once hard, and he reached out one large, scarred finger, and he touched very gently the smallest finger of the child's left hand. The child in his sleep closed his fist around his uncle's finger and would not let go. Jeremiah stood there a long time bent over the bed with the child's hand around his finger, and he did not pull away and he did not speak. Silas in the doorway said softly, "He has a strong grip, Jer. He does, Silas. He'll do. He'll do." Outside, the snow fell on the long roof of Callaway Hollow, and the fire in the iron stove burned warm, and a calf 3 years old now lowed once in the barn in the high mountain valley in the San Juans of Colorado kept as it had kept and as it would keep its slow, patient watch over the people who had chosen at last to stay. The years moved the way years move on a high mountain homestead. In the summer of Theodore's first year, the schoolhouse was built in the lower meadow of pale milled lumber, hauled up from Silverton with 2 rooms and a small bell on the roof and 12 desks made by Silas's hand. Lottie taught 14 children that first year, including 3 from the Hendricks family 35 miles south, who boarded with the Callaways during the school weeks. She taught letters and figures and history. She taught her father's old kindness to anything wounded, and she taught Walt Whitman to those who had a feeling for it. Silas taught carpentry on Saturdays. Jeremiah, true to her promise, taught marksmanship to any child of 12 or older whose parents gave consent square shoulders, half a breath out squeeze. In the spring of Theodore's third year, Silas married Tabitha Briggs, a young widow from Silverton, with a steady hand and a quiet laugh, who had walked into the general store one Saturday morning and asked if the man with the violin played any Stephen Foster, and who had stood in the doorway listening while Silas, blushing under his beard, played "Hard Times Come Again No More" for the first stranger in 12 years. They were married in the apple orchard by Reverend Hendricks at the same long pine table on which the wedding contract had been signed, and they built their own small cabin a quarter-mile up the creek, where the creek ran cold and clear out of 2 pale stones, and where in time they raised 3 children of their own. In the autumn of Theodore's 5th year, Jeremiah married Abigail Hendricks, the eldest daughter of the preacher who had stitched his cheekbone in the snow. She had grown up tall and serious with her mother's dark hair and her father's gentle hands, and she had loved Jeremiah Callaway since she was 17 years old and had nursed him through a fever night 3 winters before. Their wedding was held in the small, new church Reverend Hendricks had built in the foothills, and Jeremiah, when he turned to her at the altar, had a face Lottie had never seen on him before. It was not the face of a younger brother. It was not the face of a man who had buried a woman in his youth. It was the face of a man who had lived finally long enough to be loved twice, and who had decided at last to allow it. In the spring of Theodore's 7th year, Lottie bore a daughter. She was named Wilhelmina Cordelia Callaway, after no one in particular, except that Cordelia was the name of a young woman in Virginia who had loved Eli Callaway in 1864, and Lottie had asked gently on the porch one evening if he might mind, and he had not minded. He had wept again. He had said only, "She would have been kind to you, Lottie. She would have been very, very kind." Wilhelmina called Willa from the day she could speak. Her own name was a wild thing with her mother's honey blonde hair and her father's steady amber eyes. By the age of 5, she could ride. By the age of 7, she could shoot. By the age of 10, she could read 4 languages, having decided on her own that she wished to. In the summer of Theodore's 10th year, a 3rd child came, a boy. They named him Bartholomew Silas Callaway, called Bart after the gentle uncle whose violin he would in time learn to play. The cabin grew. The barn grew. The herd grew. The 5 apple trees became 15, then 25, then by the spring of 1895, a proper orchard of 40 trees that bore so heavily in the autumn of that year that Silas drove a wagon load of apples to Silverton and sold them, and the sign on the wagon read in Lottie's clear schoolmistress hand, "Bellamy Callaway Orchard, Callaway Hollow, Colorado." There were hard years. There were always hard years. The winter of 1886 took 8 head of cattle. The drought of 1890 burned the upper pasture brown by July. In 1893, Silas's youngest boy, 3 years old, took a fever and nearly died, and would have except that Lottie, who was no doctor but who had been her father's daughter, ate up with him for 9 straight nights, with her father's stethoscope around her neck and her father's voice in her own throat. And the fever broke at last, and the boy lived, and Silas and Tabitha, who had no proper words for what she had done, simply began that following Christmas to call her not Lottie but sister, and they did not stop for the rest of their lives. In 1899, Reverend Obadiah Hendricks died at the age of 73 in his own bed, with his wife and his daughter Abigail, and his son-in-law Jeremiah, and his 3 grandchildren around him. They buried him on the south slope above his church. Lottie spoke at the grave in front of more than 200 people, and what she said was not a sermon. It was simpler than that. She said, "He stitched my brother's face in a blizzard, and he would not take payment. He married my husband to me under an apple tree. He buried my children's umbilical cords in his own churchyard, with my permission that they might have roots in this country. He was not my father, but he was after my father the kindest man I ever knew, and there are not many of those." The schoolhouse had 30 children in it by 1900. The orchard had 50 trees. The young men of the valley, when they wished to court a young woman, came to ride first up the trail to Callaway Hollow, where Mrs. Charlotte Callaway sat them down at the long pine table, fed them coffee, and asked them 3 questions. What is your name? What is your work? What is your word? They learned in time to come prepared with answers. There were federal marshals once on the trail in 1903. They had ridden up to inform her in person that Cyrus Drake had died in his cell at the Detroit Penitentiary of a winter pneumonia at the age of 68. He had been buried in a pauper's grave outside the prison wall. He had named no next of kin. No one had claimed the body. Lottie thanked the marshals. She fed them dinner. She sent them home with apples. That evening on the porch with Elijah beside her in the rocking chair, he had built her with his own hands the spring after Theodore was born. She said only, "He died alone, Eli. He did. In a way that was somehow harder than what he tried to do to us." It was Lottie. "I do not feel triumph. I thought I would. I do not. No, my love, triumph was never the point. What was?" He thought a long while. The sun was low. The orchard, white with the second blossom of a late, wet spring, glowed in the gold light. "The point," he said at last, "was that when you stepped off that stagecoach in November, you were alone. And tonight you are not. And our children are not. And our brothers are not. And our brothers' children are not. And the 30 children in the schoolhouse and their mothers and their fathers are not. He spent his whole life trying to take. We have spent ours, Lottie, learning to give. And here we are on this porch in this valley, watching the apples bloom for the 25th time. That is the point. That has always been the point." She did not answer. She reached across the small table between the rocking chairs, and she took his hand, and she held it, and they watched the sun go down behind the western shoulder of the San Juan Range. The bear coat that had hung on the iron hook beside her bedroom door for 24 years was by now long since worn through and had been retired to the cedar chest at the foot of the bed, where the children sometimes pulled it out and wrapped themselves in it in winter, smelling on it, the old smoke of a Colorado that none of them had ever known, and was already even then beginning to pass. The hook itself was still there. It would be there, she sometimes thought, long after she was gone. Theodore Tobias Callaway, who had been born in a snowstorm in February of 1880, grew up tall and dark and steady with his father's eyes and his mother's quiet laugh. At 18, he rode east to Philadelphia with 2 letters in his saddlebag, one from Justice Augustus Harrington and one from Senator Cornelius McKean, both addressed to the Dean of the Jefferson Medical College. He was admitted on the strength of those letters and on the work of his own hand. 4 years later, in the spring of 1902, he came home a doctor in a fine black suit and with his grandfather's old leather medical bag, and he hung out his shingle in Silverton, and he rode the 70 miles up to Callaway Hollow once a month for the rest of his working life to see his mother, whose lungs in old age would be weak and who would never on his orders spend another winter alone in any cabin without a doctor's son under the same roof. Wilhelmina Cordelia Calloway, called Willa, married a Wyoming rancher named Jonas Pickett in 1905 and bore him 4 children and ran his ranch beside him with a colt on her hip and a textbook of agricultural science on her saddle, and lived to be 93. Bartholomew Silas Calloway, called Bart, played the violin like his uncle and farmed apples like his father, and never married, and lived in the cabin at Callaway Hollow with his parents, and then alone for many years after, and tended the orchard, and wrote in his late life a long, quiet book about the high country, which Lottie in her last years helped him to edit. The book was published after her death by a small press in Denver and is still in certain mountain houses in Colorado, kept on shelves beside the family Bible. The cabin Elijah Calloway had built with his own hands in 1874 stood for 137 years. It is in the year these words are set down a small private museum kept by a great-great-granddaughter of Theodore Calloway, who is herself a doctor in Silverton, and who comes up the trail in the summer months to keep the dust off the long pine table and to oil the iron hook beside the bedroom door. The hook is still there. The bear coat is still there, folded now in a glass case beside it. A small handwritten note in a careful Victorian hand sits beside the case. It reads in faded ink. This coat hung on this hook for 24 years. The first night it hung there, I was 24 years old, and the only home I had left in the world was the one I had stepped into that afternoon. I did not know that night that I had come home. I learned it slowly in the kindness of 3 men, in the music of a violin, in the strong grip of a child's hand around an uncle's finger, in the smell of bacon on a cold morning, in the silence of a man drinking tea by lantern light when he had said he did not drink tea. I learned it because they taught me, and I am writing it here because the lesson in the end is the only thing worth leaving. You are home now. Wherever you are reading this, you are home now if you can find the people, however few they are, around whose table you may sit and not be afraid. Find them, stay with them, build it together. The winter always ends. The spring always comes, and the story in the end is not the storm, but the porch you walk back onto when the storm was through. Charlotte Edith Calloway, Callaway Hollow, Colorado, 1925. Charlotte Bellamy Calloway lived to be 71 years old. She died in her own bed in February of 1925 on a snowy night, not unlike the one that had brought her son Theodore into the world, with her husband holding her hand on one side and her grown daughter Willa holding her hand on the other, and her 2 surviving brothers-in-law, both white-haired, now sitting in chairs by the foot of the bed. She did not speak much at the end, but the last clear thing she said, while there was still light in her eyes, was said directly to Elijah. She said, "I came home." He said, "You came home." She said, "You called me home." He said, "I did, my love, and you stayed." And she closed her eyes, and she went at last the way the snow goes off a high mountain valley, in the long, slow turning of the year, soft and certain and entirely her own. The stagecoach door on a cold November afternoon in 1878 had swung open with a dry creak, and Charlotte Bellamy had stepped down into nothing. 47 years later, on a porch in the Colorado high country, with apple blossoms on the wind and the long shadow of a single hawk crossing the rocky slope where she had first stood, young Willa Pickett, 18 years old that spring, named for her own mother Wilhelmina, who had in turn been named for a girl in Virginia, in 1864 stood in the doorway of the cabin her grandfather had built with his own hands and looked out across the valley. Her grandmother had quietly, patiently, for half a century, made into a home. And she thought in words very nearly her grandmother's own, the letter had promised a home. The letter in the end had not lied at all.